About what we're going to say today. One of the first things I always do when I make a talk is I ask the audience to raise their hands for all the people in this group who are innovators. Would you just raise your hand? It's interesting for me to watch. Some people are doing this. Is that the Queen's wave? Or no, I guess that's like that. I'd say looking out there, probably about 50% of the people who said you're innovators. I'm going to give you a quick story, and then I'll ask that question again to see how many people raise their hand. So I spent a lot of my life in Boston. So you can imagine, if you would, put yourself in a scenario. You're in Boston in February, and a big snowstorm. Everybody got the picture? And you're staying at the Motel 3. It's half as good as the 6. And it's the kind of motel that opens up to the outside, and you're on the second floor, and there's a USA Today paper under a pile of snow like this. It's about 6 a.m. in the morning. You're in bare feet and a bathrobe. So you want that paper. So you open the door, you reach for it, you can't quite get it. One more step, you got it, but unfortunately you lose your balance, and you find yourself slipping outside in your bathrobe, bare feet, and the door locks behind you. Everybody in the scenario with me? How many of you are innovators? If you don't raise your hand now, Darwin was right. You deserve to die in the snow out there, okay? All right, so I'm not worried. I'm actually not really worried about people who are looking in this audience, because we're all built to be innovators. In fact, I would submit to you that all of you have innovative genes. How many of you know how to use a rubber band for something other than its intended purpose? Chewing gum? You could probably use chewing gum for something different. We do that every day. So I'm not worried, nor do I spend a lot of time worrying about the human being's ability to be innovative. It's wired in. You get yourself in a position like the scenario I gave you, you call on those brain cells and you start to be inventive. The problem happens when we get into organizations that certain things start to happen and evolve that actually cause innovation to be harder and harder to get done. And so for small businesses in the audience, your big warning is, how do you keep yourself from being overrun by the things that kill innovation? And for larger organizations, how do those organizations counterbalance bureaucracy and a lot of things that stand in the way of innovation that cause innovation not to happen? Now, I spend a lot of time taking the admirals in my course up to Google and Silicon Valley, and those places are great, but they've got it built into the genes. They're already innovative. They don't have to learn to be. So what I do is I spend a lot of my time in the Navy going around to commands, and in the private business I have, I also am a small business owner. I go and try to help people figure out how to generate, embed, and sustain innovation. I'm going to show you some statistics in a minute that will make it a little bit scary for us to understand what's going on in today's modern businesses. We're seeing a mortality rate of businesses that's unprecedented. So a lot of companies are not able to keep themselves going. In the old days, remember, you used to bet on the blue chip stocks like GM and Chrysler and all those companies? Those are not safe bets necessarily anymore. So a lot's changed, and the mortality rate is moving very, very quickly. So let me see, Sean, is this the guy right here? All right, we got it. So let me just give you a quick, and I'm not going to, is it okay if I don't read every bullet on every slide? Okay, I just want to make sure that's okay. I taught a group of actuaries one time, and they said, if you have a bullet, you read it. But you have to know something about actuaries to understand that, right? So if you just take a look quickly at the data, particularly the last one, and this is not exactly modern, this is not quite up to date because it doesn't take into account the last couple of years of mortality of organizations, but take a look at the last one. The first index of 90 major US companies was created in the 1920s. The firm on that original list stayed there for an average of 65 years, not bad lifespan. By 1998, the average tenure of a firm on the expanded S&P was 10 years. That kind of churn rate is unbelievable. Well, technology is changing, so we see organizations being surprised by their competitors, being upset by technology more than ever in the past. So it's hard to keep yourself up to date, keep yourself innovative, and so I spend a lot of time trying to help people understand that concept and then to embed it in their organizations. Now, in talking about this, I wanted to find out some company that had done a really good job of staying alive. Anybody guess how old the oldest company is in the world? Just average age. 200 years? Less than 200? Okay, more than 200. A couple of people think that. Well, I came across this organization, sort of a very different kind of organization, called Congo Gumi. And it existed from 578 to 2006 when it got bought by another company. and is still operating today as a subsidiary. I said, how did that organization live that long? If you look at my statistics right here, the mortality rate is horrible. And all of a sudden, this company figured out some way to do it. Well, it doesn't hurt to be in a religion business. They're temple builders. But one could make the argument that their temples aren't particularly any better than anybody else's temple. And so how did they stay alive for so long? One of the things this company did was innovate, but had nothing to do with their product or services. In Japan at the time, the moral code was to have the firstborn son always run and inherit the business. It wasn't too long before Kongo Gumi realized that some of their firstborn sons were idiots. And they decided they could no longer survive if they were going to stick to that value system. So they started to promote women into positions. This was unheard of back then. And they also found that they would adopt. They were allowed to adopt, so they'd go out and adopt some of the smartest adoptive sons you could find. And that kind of methodology caused them to be innovative over the years. Nothing in terms of service, nothing in terms of difference in product, but their idea of being able to be flexible and have smart people working for them really turned the tide. And that's a pretty long lifespan. It's very hard for anybody to imagine that. Companies in the US, 150 years is about the max, okay? So one of the things I worry about is how do we get people to think about ways that they can keep reinventing themselves? Given the mortality rate I just showed you, it's very, very important. Well, it's not too hard to be clever. In fact, we see a lot of cleverness. So I don't know if anybody in this room likes to work with wood, but there's a company called Weyerhaeuser. And Weyerhaeuser is in the lumber products business, and that's not a very exciting business necessarily, but they make lumber and they sell it to people. They're sitting around trying to figure out how to be innovative. So how do we keep going? How do we keep growing? What do we need to do? How do we become clever? Observation is to come out and try to bring innovation to the Navy, key component of innovation. So they started observing everything that their people did with lumber, from the day they shipped it out to the time that the constructor got a hold of it to when he built it, and then finally when he threw it out. And they watched that whole value chain. We call it, in this case, processes. You can see the processes here. So they watched all their processes from start to finish. They said, is there any value that we're using or losing, or any value we could gain? So a couple of people observed that whole value chain, and they saw the people throwing the lumber out. If you look at somebody who's in the construction business, they're building a house, they have to hire a dumpster. That dumpster comes on, they throw stuff in the dumpster, somebody picks it up, they weigh it, and then they charge the builder. So these guys at Weyerhaeuser came along to the builders and they said, we're going to give you a free dumpster. All you have to do is separate the wood products, throw them in our dumpster, we'll take it away for free. What do you think they do with that dumpster? They take it back to Weyerhaeuser, chop it up, make particle board, and sell it to the builder who just gave it to them for free. Not bad, huh? Not bad. I spent a lot of time in Boston. There's a bank called Citizens Bank. And in terms of presence, you see there's a way to be, these are all categories of innovation. This company got very successful. Citizens Bank is a tiny player compared to Bank of Boston. So they started to put their tellers into Stop and Shop grocery stores. Now, as you notice, it's sort of a common thing to have a bank in a grocery store. Their services and products aren't any better than Bank of America, but they're present. So now they've grown their business dramatically just by being there and being available. Most bankers, what is it, 10 to 3? Maybe that's not quite fair. Maybe 9 to 4. That might be more fair. But they just simply grew their business by that. Dell Computers, many of you know, most people say that they're successful and innovative because of their ability to make computers on command, on demand. Actually, their brilliance is because they get your money up front. All the other makers of computers at the time stock them in stores, pay for inventory, and they don't sell them until you come along and buy them. So they changed the whole financial model of that industry. Computers aren't better than anybody else's, but their business model, particularly their financial model, they get the money before you get the computer. No money locked up in inventory, easy to take the money and use it for investment, free cash flow, brilliant. So I'm not worried about the ability of people to be smart. In fact, there are lots of ways to do that. One of the reasons it's so fun to have small businesses is that oftentimes we look at you folks as faster movers, as people who are often entrepreneurial on the cutting edge, and you can do things a lot quicker than we do, and you have a lot of ideas that we would never have. So outreach is really important. We're doing that all over the Navy. We're starting our own open innovation platforms so we can bring in thousands of people to help us work on a challenge. very, very big movement right now in the military and in the government, this open sourcing information where we use computer-based technology and throw it open to thousands of people to help us solve a challenge. So I'm not worried about this kind of issue. I'm more worried about how do you keep the thing going? How do you keep innovation going? So I spend a lot of time going around to different groups in the Navy and outside. And one of the things I find is I'll often get called in because an organization has set up something called an innovation cell or an innovation group. And I go out to meet them and I say, how's it going? They say, well, it's good. I say, well, what are you innovating on? They say, new ideas. I say, about what? Well, creativity. Yeah, about what? Well, to be smarter. Okay, keep going. And they go around and around. I met with one group, it was a government group, and finally after a little interrogation, they said, actually, we don't know why the hell we're meeting. But we know we're supposed to be innovative and we're told to be innovative, so we're innovating, right? I said, don't start with ideation, start with intent. Why do you need new thinking? So if I leave you with one thought before you leave the room, if any of you are interested in innovation, never speak of it as a destination. Like people, we talk about it this way and businesses talk about, we're going to arrive at innovation. There's a little town. There's a little sign that says, you are now at innovation. When you start with that, it's the wrong starting point. Innovation is a set of tools or processes to help you do something better, differently, smarter, faster, cheaper. It's not an end in itself. It's a set of tools and processes to help people be inventive, to deal with the ideas that wouldn't normally have come because you're thinking outside the box. But when you start with innovation as a destination, then people run around like crazy and they don't know exactly what they mean by that, but they're ideating. And you may have seen the IBM commercial a few years ago where a guy walks in and a bunch of the people in this company are on the floor singing a mantra. He said, what are they doing? He said, they're ideating. He said, when's somebody going to do some work, right? So not a bad way of thinking about that. So as we think about what I worry about, and I worry about it with the Navy, I worry about it with private businesses that I work with as well, the generation part's not hard. We know how to generate ideas. There are lots of techniques to do it. I take people up to IDEO Corporation up in Palo Alto. They probably crack the code better than anybody on how to generate ideas. I get more worried about embedding and sustaining innovation over the long run. You saw that list of people on those companies who sort of took a nosedive after a few years and didn't maintain their longevity. It's because they didn't have a good way of embedding and sustaining innovation. So I want to talk a little bit about that and leave you with some thoughts about how small businesses have to be very careful. There are a couple of innovation killers that lurk in every organization, large, small, and medium, that if you don't pay attention to them, pretty soon they come along and they take the average Joe. All of you would have good ideas, and they take people who would have given you some really good ideas and are smart, because ideas exist everywhere. That's human potential. And those ideas never surface. Or if they surface, they get killed. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go. So here's one starter, and then I'll finish this off at the end of my talk. So I used to do some work with a company called Daimler Chrysler, and Chrysler as well. And there's a Jeep vehicle called the Jeep Rubicon. And it's a very high-end off-roader, considered the best off-road mass-produced vehicle in the world, the Jeep Rubicon Wrangler. And Jim Repp was the engineer behind that. And he's in charge of Jeep development. So he had this idea for a mass-produced Jeep. And most people in the wild off-road Jeep community take a regular Jeep and they put $10,000 to $15,000 extra in that vehicle just to upgrade it. They put different axles on it. They put different wheels on it, different suspensions. That Jeep is nowhere like the Jeep that they bought because they want to upgrade it. So Jim looked at all these Jeepers and he said, why don't we as Chrysler do that for them? We can mass produce that for them. We can put all that hardware on. They don't have to, and we can do it at half the price. Brilliant idea. What do you think his marketing colleague said? You're an engineer. What the heck do you know about marketing? We are the marketers. We know about markets. There's zero opportunity, so shut up. Really a good culture for innovation, as you could tell at the time. Very, very, very helpful. So some people who are innovators in this room are also a little bit entrepreneurial. They sort of go together. Entrepreneurs are the kind of people who are innovators, but they have an extra added feature that says, I'm going to take that innovation and create value out of it. So a lot of innovators who don't have the entrepreneurial mindset, which is how do I take some innovation and then create value out of it. So Jim's one of those guys that said, I'm not done. You tell me no, that only makes me madder. It's like a bull with a red flag. He said, I'm going to go do this anyway, and I'm going to prove that you're all wrong. We call it a little chip on your shoulder. A lot of innovators and slash entrepreneurs have that little chip on your shoulder. You can test it on yourself. So if you have a good idea and you go to somebody and you say, hey, we should do this, and they say no, what do you think to yourself? Some of you might be doing this. Oh, yeah? You probably have kids that do this, right? Uh-huh. You said, no, guess what? I'm going to do it anyway, right? And so some of these people are the people actually that we try to look for, don't do it illegally, unethically, but who figure out a way to get things done for the greater good despite the organizational barriers. That's where the new tome that we talked about at the very beginning, that's where I spent most of my time, is trying to identify the people who are able to get things done in bureaucracies and sort of anti-innovation venues and do it legally, ethically, morally, but do it for the greater good. So Jim Repp, as you now know, got Jeep Chrysler to build the Rubicon, which is the most successful mass-produced off-road vehicle in the world, and against all the odds. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about how he did that, just to give you some idea of some of the things that we talk about. So I worry about the last two, embedding and sustaining. Not so easy to do. So one of the things I did in my research is I tried to figure out, so all these organizations that say they want innovation, and by the way, IBM has done a study about every 2 years, IBM does a study with Fortune 500 top executives. And they always ask them, like, what's on your mind? What do you worry about? Guess what's always 1, 2, or 3 in that list? Innovation. So if you ask them what's the top 3 things, innovation always shows up. And they're always dissatisfied with how well their companies are doing on innovation. And they're dissatisfied because if you look at the number of products that go on the market, a lot of them fail. They can't sort of get the organization to respond. And so they complain. I want innovation, but I can't seem to quite get it. Oftentimes, they don't realize that what they built in their own organization actually is killing innovation, but they don't see it. So that's where I spent my time, looking at organizations that say they want innovation. It's usually a value or a core belief, but they can't get it. So what's wrong? So in the research, I went out and I did interviews of people who seemed to be those kind of people who innovated despite the odds. And I tried to figure out, so what are they doing? And what's on the dais that kills those ideas and makes them hard to do? So let me take you through a couple things. And by the way, you could do a little self-assessment of your own organization on this, because there are 2 dimensions that always seem to show up when an organization says it wants innovation, but it has trouble getting it. There are 2 things that always stand in the way. And I'll give you a little sort of a mini assessment, so you can do your own little mini assessment of where you think your organization is on these dimensions. I'll give you a website at the end. There's a more thorough description of this, but I want to give you just a quick analysis of what I found in doing this research. So it was interview-based. I looked for people who innovated, got big wins against the odds. So somehow they did something that other people weren't able to do. So I said, give me a time when you really found it hard to innovate and you were successful, called the critical incident technique. In fact, I talked to one guy at ADT, which is a data processing company. Does a lot of very detailed stuff, very risk averse, yet he was an innovator in that company. I said, how did you survive and innovate? He said, well, sometimes I got rewarded and sometimes I didn't. So, okay, but I loved it. I loved doing it. But he said the secret is when the door is slammed in your face, let it hit a different part of your head the next time, right? So I thought that was pretty sage advice, right? So you walk into the door, then you back up and take another, and he was very successful, but it wasn't easy. So I tried to extract some of the common innovation leadership principles. I wound up using a judo metaphor. So you heard the word judo. Judo I took when I was in college. I took it because it was either swimming, for PT in college. I had to do swimming, and swimming for me was always staying alive in the water. So that didn't sound really good. So I figured maybe judo would be fun. So I took judo for 4 years in college. And anybody knows the martial arts, it's the gentle art. It never hurts anybody. It disables them temporarily. But unlike karate and some of the other things that are martial arts, judo unbalances people, flips them over, puts them on the ground, disables them temporarily. So when I talk about these skills, I don't want anybody to disable their organization. I just want them to disable roadblocks and blockheads long enough so that maybe an idea has a chance of survival. So let me just give you a quick overview of what I found. And there's a dangerous intersection that seems to arise in many organizations. That intersection is described by 2 dimensions. The first one is called complexity. The more complexity we see built into an organization, the more likely it is for people to have a hard time figuring out where to go with ideas, what to do with them, who to see, what's the road, what's the path. So complexity is one of the dimensions I worry about. We as people have all kinds of tools now. And man, can we build complexity. Anybody here a Lean Six Sigma person? Okay, great stuff, right? I get worried when the company's more worried about how many black belts they have than making a good product that somebody cares about. There are some companies that built a perfect product that nobody buys. Siemens is no longer in the cell phone industry, right? Great company. They built a great phone, but in China, an okay phone was good enough. So, how do you get inventive? So complexity is important. And the other one is a little more serious and a little more painful, something called wackiness. Now, I don't mean to use wackiness as a pejorative term, but I found out that some companies actually have a lot of wackiness involved in their organizations. Let me give you a couple of examples of wackiness. So a CEO who says, I need more innovators. I want our people to take more risks. Really important for innovation. And by the way, don't make a mistake. How's that for wackiness? Huh? You can't innovate without mistakes. You can't learn without trying, fixing, doing, fast failing, learn quickly. That's a good example of wackiness. Organizations also fragment like computers. So if in the Navy, if a new commander comes in, there's stuff left over from the last regime. If a new CEO comes into your business, there's some stuff left over from the last regime. Very rarely does that stuff get removed. It just gets added onto by more stuff. It's like a computer being fragmented. So you wind up, for example, having a SAP at one time, had the guy who was one of the founders sign off on every single travel voucher for $500 or more. Can you imagine that, the founder of SAP, looking at all the travel vouchers for $500? Think about what that does for slowing an organization down, right? That's just wackiness. Intended probably for one time as an entrepreneur at SAP, makes sense to cut costs, but boy, when you start having the senior people spend all their time looking at $500 vouchers, you got to ask, how helpful is that to innovation? So wackiness is illogic. Wackiness is politics. It's where Jim Rep goes to marketing with a great idea about a Jeep Wrangler, and he's told to get lost. In an organization that doesn't have wackiness, you would expect the marketing people to say, hey, Jim, that's a good idea. Let's talk more about it. Let's see what you have to offer. Instead, immediately it was a silo. They closed the doors on him and said, mind your own business. That's wackiness. Gets in the way of innovation, gets in the way of business. But the people who generate that don't understand that that's happening. So I worry about 4 intersections that evolves. So you might ask yourself in your own organization, if you were to rate yourself or have your people rate yourself on the degree of complexity, what kind of rating would they give you if you had a 5-point scale? You say 1 is low complexity, 5 is high. And you can do the same thing for wackiness. And I'll give you some quick examples. One of my favorites is hypoacronymic. I made that word up. It's hard even to say. Some organizations that I know have acronyms for acronyms. The more acronyms you have, the more complex you probably are, because you have to speak in a code. And people coming in have a hell of a time understanding that code. When it comes to innovation, for example, complex organizations make it very difficult for me as an individual or anybody who's got a really good idea to figure out where do I go unless somebody has built a pathway to some organizational component that listens to ideas. And we're trying to do that in the Navy, but it's not easy. And I'll talk more about that for other things. So simple, runs on logic, clear objectives and goals. All these kind of things are part of a simple organization. Complexity, on the other hand, you can see what happens. It might run on logic, but there's so many people, it's not sure who's in charge. I mean, who do you go to for help? At NPS, it took me 6 months to find the restroom, right? And that's not, I'm a slow learner, but still, that's too long, right? And some shared objectives and goals, slow learning curve, hard to explain to others. So it's very hard to explain the Navy to other people. It's very hard to explain IBM to other people. They're very complex organizations. And complexity makes it hard for the average citizen with a great idea to figure out where to go unless somebody's built a pathway to that. So if you look at wackiness, there are a couple things that are important. Notice that one of the most important things in an organization that has low wackiness, a lot of things revolve around the customer. The customer is king. And organizations that tend to be a little bit less logical, all of a sudden things start to evolve around the boss, or what the boss wants, what the boss cares about, how the boss is feeling today, and the customer is less. Serengeti Eyewear, a famous company who was very successful in the sunglass business, the boss of that whole organization said, I'm not the boss, the customer is the boss, and he built everything to work around the customer. In fact, you couldn't even go to a meeting room and use a conference room at Serengeti unless a customer was there. He said, I don't want to have internal and eternal meetings about ourselves, talking about ourselves. If somebody wants to use a conference room, a customer has to be present. And they bring in customers all the time. They even send out their senior executives to sell sunglasses at some of these big places like Pearl Vision on weekends. Senior vice president has to go out and sell sunglasses. That keeps you a little close to the customer. Very good idea. So I worry about these two things and how do companies combat them. Because for a small business, these start to grow. You start to add things. And if somebody's not watching what you're adding, you can start adding things that get in the way of people's ability to innovate. When you take Lean Six Sigma to the ultimate end, and you worry about more black belts than getting a good product that somebody cares about, then you've taken it too far. We can measure everything today. If you got more measurements than you need, that's a problem. I work for a large company that had, we actually took a chance to see how many reports they filled out for the accounting department, the salespeople. They lost a month of selling time because of all the reports they had to fill out for the finance people and the accounting people. A month. They put a figure on that, and they calculated how much business they lost in that event. So let me go back here to counteracting strategies. Well, so small businesses, you got to watch out for this wackiness stuff. You got to watch out for silos, people who start to worry more about their little enclave than the king who is the customer. That's the most important thing. And it's easy for these things to happen without your paying attention to it. A lot of CEOs are worried about the stock market. They look up instead of saying, well, how do we get that way? And then when they get larger, they wind up and saying, I don't have any clue as to how we get this way. And disassembling that's very hard. It's very hard to disassemble bureaucracy. In fact, I don't even talk about culture change anymore. I think it's sort of a waste of time. I talk about trying to go in and do sort of surgical strikes where you start to change some things you can in an organization and build on those instead of going in and trying to take a big cultural change. So the other thing to do is condense complexity. One of the things the Navy's trying to do and other people are doing, the Coast Guard has done an excellent job of it. The Coast Guard is a bureaucracy. They describe that themselves, but they created what's called an innovation council. And they pick people with chips on their shoulder. They make them parts of that innovation council. 70% of their time is dedicated to innovation. That committee reports up to the commandant, and the commandant's watching over it. One of the guys I profiled in the book was a lieutenant commander who was on the Innovation Council. He gets a new boss down in Falmouth. And the boss says, you know, this innovation stuff you're working on, forget about it. I'm your boss. You work for me. You spend 89% working for me, and you forget about this innovation stuff. I don't want you doing it. It's a waste of your time. Chris tells the Innovation Council tells the commandant calls the guy in Falmouth who's Chris's boss and said, I don't think you understand our program, right? So that's senior level involvement. So they built literally a land of Oz, which is low complexity and low wackiness. They built a land of Oz inside a bureaucracy. Very good strategy, actually. We're trying to do some of that ourselves in our organization. So let me finish off with this innovation judo thing. I just want to finish I talk about 7 principles, and I won't go into them in detail. They're too long, and we don't have enough time to do it. But let me just give you a quick sort of overview of it. So these are the 7 things I found that these people practice in order to overcome, outsmart, figure out legally, ethically, and morally how to get stuff done when they're told no because it's for the greater good. And some of them are pretty obviously. Discipline is one, and I won't go into details, but there's a big difference between an idea and an opportunity. And many innovators talk about ideas. Entrepreneurs talk about opportunities. And there are 5 differences between an idea and an opportunity. If you don't understand that, very few people will listen to you because you're talking ideas which are ethereal, opportunities have gravity. So discipline, leverage, circling, opening, quickness, unbalancing, and what I call redirection. They're all judo principles that I learned when I was taking martial arts, but they're something that these people do which allowed me to give you a metaphor. So let me take you back to Jim Rep and the Rubicon story. And by the way, don't write a book about this stuff because then I went out and bought one of these damn things, right? I don't want to write a story about Maserati. I can't afford a Maserati, so I'm never going to write a book about Maseratis, right? But this is a typical Jeep Rubicon, so let me give you just a quick story, and then I'll finish up in just a minute. So Jim Rep is told, forget about it. There's no market for this Jeep, and so go back and go to work and shut up. And even though that was said pretty directly, a lot of organizations, they don't say it directly. They just say thanks for the idea, and then they cover it up with 16 tons of paper, and he never hears back again. But Jim's the kind of guy that we look for, who's going to, particularly in organizations that have trouble innovating, and he said, I'm going to prove them wrong. He had a chip on his shoulder. He and 3 guys took a Jeep, a regular normal Jeep, to their garage, and they secretly built what's called a mule. A mule is it's a Jeep that looks like every other Jeep, but underneath it's completely different. They also borrowed, if I can use that term, borrowed some parts from Chrysler, because Chrysler always had around really high-end off-road components just to test them. So in their garage, they built this mule, this secret ghost Jeep. And they go out to the Rubicon Trail to test all kinds of things out here in California. All kinds of people compete, Toyota. Everybody goes out there with their off-roaders, and they're all trying to compete. So Jim secretly and his team stuffed their Jeep into a Chrysler van. Nobody knows it's a special Jeep. And it goes off to the Rubicon Valley. By the way, and it's there because Jim knows that the senior executives from Chrysler are going to be on the Rubicon Trail where you camp and you can't get out for a week. Not a bad ploy, right? He's thinking. Right? So leverage, I got the bosses there. He's very disciplined. He and his team go build that Jeep, and they're very disciplined at putting it together. And then they take it out and hide it. And then they start doing all the contests, and this Jeep looks like every other Jeep. It's the only one that makes it to the top of the most difficult hill. No other Jeep makes it. And even the Toyota, nobody's even close. And it comes down the hill, so now he's got 500, 800 Jeep people. These are not people who work for Jeep. These are customers. What the hell? What's that Jeep all about? What's going on here? How could it do that? And so the president and the vice president of sales come down. They're looking at it, and they keep scratching their head. What happened in manufacturing? Did we screw up and make a good one? Right? And so finally, Jim starts to relate to them what he's done and how he's done it. And all of a sudden, more people come around, and the senior executive says, bingo, we're going to build these. So Jim, and by the way, the Innovation Council does this as well. Notice that the Innovation Council has an expo where the senior leaders get a chance to walk around the lowest Coast Guardmen's ideas. They collapse the hierarchy. Jim collapsed the hierarchy just for a while, for 4 days. Got a chance for a direct audience with the senior person. The senior saw proof of concept because he wasn't just talking about the Rubicon. He made a prototype. And the other thing he did is he had a young marketing lady who was just graduated from Harvard. And he convinced her to come out on the Rubicon Trail. This is mud holes. It's really rough. It's going up rocks. I mean, these things get banged up. And she comes in her, I don't know, what, Evan Pacone or what, some famous dress and high-heeled shoes, because she doesn't know what it's all about. And she's one of the people that's anti-Jeep, you know. So we're not going to buy this. So he purposely gets stalled in a mud hole. Everybody has to get out, including her. So she's waist deep in mud in her, you know, I don't know, $1,000 suit. And he gets her Jeepified. And so pretty soon she's into it, right? So now he's got a marketing person, and he built the Rubicon. First year of sales, the marketing people said you'll sell maybe 3 of them. 15,000 later, first year. And now they're an icon. They're one of the things that they show as one of their brands, the Rubicon, built by one person and some friends who had the courage to be an innovator and who wouldn't take no for an answer and practice some of these skills. It would be nice if he didn't have to do that. But unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't have a pathway for people to take their ideas forward. The ideas are not hard to find. People like Jim have them every day. But then how do they find a place to go? And we're not very good at providing the road, the pathway to getting there. So I'll leave you with a couple thoughts, and I'll stop at this point in time. So what are some things to do? Well, like I said earlier, approach this as a toolkit, not a destination. Don't kid yourself. Ideation is the easy part. We all do that. We know how to do it. There are techniques for doing it. A lot of people stop at that point. The hard part is getting into the organization, embedding and sustaining. That's where ideas get killed. You got to choose a strategy for doing that. I showed you, the Coast Guard has a strategy. There are other people that pick guys like Jim Rep on purpose, and they put them in positions where they can make a difference. Aggressively seek out those kind of people, and you got to counterbalance the bureaucracy. And for small businesses, keep your eye out, because these things build very easily and slowly, and all of a sudden you got a lot of stuff going on below you that doesn't really help your organization innovate. Why should you care? In today's market, I'd say if you're not innovating, you're in trouble, because things are changing so rapidly. If you're not on top of the curve, somebody's going to come around the corner with something new, and all of a sudden you're redundant. And we've seen that happen all the time. I'm around if anybody wants to talk further. I hope you got a few insights about innovation today. And I know that the Navy's looking at all you folks to help us, because we got to expand our portfolio of talent. And a lot of people outside of us have a lot of brilliant ideas. We just have to figure out ways to make it easy for you to work with us and be clever at for example, this mentoring program you told me about yesterday. Brilliant ideas of trying to take entrepreneurs and try to help them help us, because we need the help, and we can help you. Okay, Sean, thank you. Sure.
We have microphones throughout the audience if someone would like to ask a question.
As long as you don't say, is there anything in your speech that was worth listening to? That's not the kind of question I was looking for. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we actually compare, when we go up to Silicon Valley, one of the things the admirals say to me is, well, this is so different than, what we live. And then they talk for a while and they realize when they go to Google and some of these other places that even though they're more free to do certain things, they don't have all the rules and regulations around them, that they still struggle with many of the same issues that we struggle with, trying to get ideas on the table. A lot of them, in fact, Bloom Energy, some of you may know Bloom is a really sort of hot organization. I don't know, Denny, if you're going to talk about them at all, but they're pretty cool, but they have very strict budgets, even though they're an entrepreneurial organization. One of the guys that works there said, I've never worked in a cheaper company, and yet they're a startup, right? So you think of, organizations having, lots of cash and everything. So I think the governance is more difficult, and I think the frustration level in public companies is oftentimes higher because people want to do stuff, but then they run into roadblocks and blockheads, and that can wear people out. A lot of people give up. But there are clever people who, and I've got a couple of stories about government innovators as well, who figured out how to, for the greater good, get stuff done. By the way, I'm not suggesting anybody practice these skills when logic works, and I'm not suggesting that anybody practice these skills for the lesser good. If you're doing it for yourself and self-aggrandizement, then you're a manipulator. All the people I profiled said, I can help the company, I'm gonna figure out a way to do that. But there are differences. We can't be naive about that. One of the reasons I profiled some government folks is I wanted to demonstrate to the people I teach that it can be done even in your environment. So I couldn't just use private sector people to show that. Some of you may know the government's also really big on innovation platforms right now. They're doing open innovation in HHS and NASA and other places like that. There's a big movement for government to go out and get ideas way outside of themselves. But there are differences, no doubt about it. The fundamentals of innovation are the same, but the grief you have to take sometimes becomes higher. Although I would tell you that IBM and some of these big organizations, they're equally difficult to maneuver around to get an idea on the table. Yeah, equally hard.
Hey, Dr. Thornberry, just real quick, I was very interested in your comment on surgical strike versus cultural change, where you don't talk about cultural change, you're talking about surgical strike. In very large bureaucratic organizations, say DOD or IBM, which are similar in their bureaucracies, how do you make that transition from ideation to effectively what becomes a change for that organization that becomes better? At the worst example, you can use DOD 5000, which everybody agrees is a document that needs change, but cannot be changed.
Okay, so that's a big question, but let me give you my bias toward. It's a bias because my eyes glaze over when people talk about culture change. How long does it take to change a culture? I mean, so what happens in a lot of organizations? So you start a culture change process. 2 years later, a new CEO comes in, or a new commander comes in. What do they do with that change? They do something else, right? And so I get nervous that people aren't sustained long enough, either in the private sector or in the military or the government. The leaders oftentimes aren't in place long enough to bring about a cultural change. So I like to tell people, go after innovation that you can embed quickly. That will then have a spiraling effect. That particular embedding will then allow some building upon that, some proof of concept, and then that starts to wear away some of the barriers to the organization that you want. I'll give you a classic example, and I don't know if we still talk a little bit about it, John, I guess, this thing called, in the Navy, we called this, we asked people to think about this whole thing called the enterprise construct, right? The enterprise construct. And it was actually, I think, believe called a strategy at one time, the enterprise strategy. And for the Navy, that meant that if you and I were in different organizations, that we should cooperate for the greater good. And if I could save money, then I should give that money to you, and you could use it better. Well, you know how well that works, right? So that is considered an enterprise, but it was never started there. In fact, it's been dropped lately because it wasn't meant as an enterprise. It actually started out with two commanders working on a quality problem with airplane engines. The airplanes couldn't fly because they couldn't fix some of the quality problems. These two guys were pointing fingers at each other and saying, it's your fault they're not flying. And the other guy said, no, it's your fault. You know how that goes. It's not my fault, it's your fault. So their boss came along and took a very, very good leadership coaching approach. He said to them, if you guys don't fix that, I'm going to fire both of you. I thought that was sort of an interesting coaching model, right? And so they got the word. So they started to compare notes, and they started talking together. They started picking up more of the quality control. One of the guys' name was Wally Massenberg. I don't know if that name means anything to anybody. But the fear of them being fired caused them to work together, and all of a sudden they started building much better quality around these engines. They were flying better. They were using sort of Lean Six Sigma stuff, but not necessarily calling it that. That then showed proof of concept. That proof of concept then led other people to start applying it. The word got out, it started to build, and so what you see now is a rippling effect. So one of my ideas of culture change is if you can start little nuggets like this that can be embedded, another commander comes on, sees how well we're doing, why would you give that up, right? So I like the idea of starting little fires here and there, trying to build on them, show proof of concept, and then leverage those to expand the world. And then those things actually can have an effect on culture, not for the Navy writ large. I mean, that's a huge organization, but I've seen different areas and different groups apply tactics like that are not culture change, but they wind up having an effect on culture change. And it's often less scary to people because I don't go to them and say, I'm going to change your whole culture. Right? You guys on board? Oh, yeah, thanks. Really, really like that. It's a great idea. Because we like our culture the way it is, or maybe not, but changing is hard. I like this because it does it in a way that proves the concept and gives some positive results, or maybe not, then you drop it, as opposed to saying to people, we're going to change your culture. That's scary. I get a couple wins around an engine that gets to fly. All of a sudden, everybody looks at it and said, thank God, we're flying again and we're not having all those problems. It starts to pick up steam. So yeah, I see all the things about, culture change, and we get out and we wave the flag and say we're going to be something else and all that stuff. I don't think that's wrong. I just think it takes a long time. It'd be nice to start some things over here that actually have a rippling effect. And I've seen companies do that, where they change the culture by creating something inside that looks good. You don't change the whole culture necessarily, but enough to make a difference. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's why I'm a little off on culture change, because I think it takes too long, and the people who started leave, and then you're stuck with somebody else coming in saying, we didn't like that, we're going to do something else. So I'm more concerned about operational performance and sometimes using that as a lever to cause the organization to change. Nothing, by the way, like an innovative new product that people clamor for in the marketplace. All of a sudden, your organization has taken down a completely different path that you never planned on. That's better than standing up there talking about how we need to change. Customer is king. Oftentimes that helps. Government's different, I understand. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your time.